And joining us now is Dennis Sandole, a professor of conflict analysis and resolution at George Mason University, and he joins us from Washington. Sir, I think you just heard Mr. Radovan talking about the Milosevic trial and what we can expect from Karadzic. Milosevic was not very cooperative with the court. Will Karadzic play that same game, in your opinion?
Yes, Mr. Matheson. I think Mr. Karadzic will definitely invoke the Milosevic model, and by defending himself, by attempting to defend himself, and as your previous guest said, obstruct the process of justice, delay the proceedings, and let them run as long as possible before justice could be adequately served.
And while that's happening, there was a massive protest yesterday in Belgrade. Do you think these protests that we've seen, going back to the Kosovo protests, are they a fair gauge of how the general Serbian population feels about how they are being treated by the West and about how Karadzic is being prosecuted?
I think they're a fair gauge of a segment of the Serb population in Serbia. I think, according to the Financial Times, there were roughly 11,000 protesters on the streets of Belgrade yesterday. According to the Washington Post, some 15,000. In either case, are those numbers close to the 100,000 people who are out in the streets of Belgrade in February protesting the unilateral declaration of independence by the dominant Albanian Muslim population in Kosovo. So I think while virulent ethnocentrism and nationalism still exists amongst Serbs in Serbia, that they're on the wane, that the majority of Serbs now wish to leave history, climb out of the nationalistic past, and move toward a future secured by entry in the European Union.
So you think this trial can do that by itself, can close a chapter and open a new door?
Regrettably, I think the trial itself will not do that. I think there is a need for other processes, other mechanisms to work with Serbs, perhaps even trauma healing with Serbs themselves. We're talking about, Mr. Matheson, some major psychological defense mechanisms that work here. I'm quite convinced that Radovan Karadzic himself, a psychiatrist, a medical man, a poet, who's been operating as an alternative healer, therapist for a number of years now, probably does not accept the 11 counts of genocide and crimes against humanity currently against him.
During those protests yesterday, we talked to a handful of people who were on the scene, journalists who cover the Balkans, and it was mentioned that an awful lot of Serbs feel like they're being centered out. They don't deny that some of their people did bad things, but they say the Croats, they did terrible things. The Muslims in Bosnia, they did terrible things. Why are you picking on us? How do you respond to that?
Well, that's true, and you have two levels of data measurement here. Either the Serbs were involved or not, either the Croats were involved or not, either the Bosniak Muslims were involved in perpetrating acts of violence. That's all true. But at the ordinal level, in terms of assigning weights, the Serbs did more of the horrible, atrocious things than either the Croats, who are next in a lineup, and certainly far more than the Bosniak Muslims, who were the majority victims throughout the war. So one of the reasons why the Serbs seem to be getting picked on is that more of them are complicit in acts of atrocious aggression, primarily against the Bosniak Muslims of Bosnia.
Speaking of more of them, is it imperative to get our hands on Ratko Mladic?
Absolutely, and here I think we see Serb President Boris Tadic performing a very sensitive balancing act between the small number of remaining virulent Serb nationalists on the one hand amongst his constituents and the great majority of Serbs who wish to move toward Europe. I think the security services currently under President Tadic's control know exactly where General Ratko Mladic is, but I think to avoid overtaxing remaining Serb nationalist sentiments, he has not yet been picked up, and I think that will happen in due course.
Dennis Sandole, nice talking to you, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson.